Hello and welcome to the last online session of this series, Research on Emotions from the Philosophy of Mental Health. My name is Ferran Molins and I am a clinical psychiatrist. I am a member of the working group de treball de formació from the Associació Catalana de Professionals de la Salut Mental. We are a growing mental health professionals association in Catalonia with more than 200 members linked to the Spanish Asociación Española de Neuropsiquiatría. If you like our contents, do not hesitate to subscribe to our YouTube channels. We will leave more information of the association and how to become a member in the description. We are very grateful to all the amazing speakers who have accepted to participate in these webinars. And today I would like to introduce Professor Thomas Fuchs. He is a psychiatrist and philosopher, Karl Jaspers Professor of Philosophy and Psychiatry and head of the section Phenomenological Psychopathology and Psychotherapy at the Psychiatric Department in the University of Heidelberg. His major research areas are phenomenological psychopathology and psychology, embodied and active cognitive science. And with that said, I will let Professor Fuchs begin his talk.
Fine, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ferran, for your introduction and for your invitation to this conference, to this lecture. I hope I'm well understood, and I'm going to share my screen then to start with my lecture on embodied affectivity and interaffectivity. Now it should be visible. Okay, dear colleagues, it's about the connection of affectivity, interaffectivity, and embodiment. And the question, which is also, of course, important for psychiatry, of how interpersonal empathy and mutual understanding may be achieved, has been a dominant debate in social cognition, social neuroscience over the last 2 or 3 decades. And the prevailing view is still the assumption that other minds are in principle hidden to us. So this is the cognitive paradigm. And therefore, possible routes towards understanding others can only take the kind of detour of relying on cognitive mechanisms such as theory of mind, mind reading, mentalizing, simulation, and so on, which allow us to infer others' states of mind. So the assumption is that the mind of others is basically inner and hidden to us. And the assumption is that we are more or less detached observers of the behavior and utterances and expressions of others. And the assumption is that there is an inner representation which we have to evoke in ourselves of others' mental states, instead of looking at the bodily interaction with others. So in this view, empathy is also based on mind reading or a simulation of others' mental states inside oneself. And this paradigm applies to emotions in general. According to the cognitive concept of emotions, they are not regarded as embodied responses to meaningful situations, and thus they would be perceivable in the bodily expression and conduct of another person. No, they are regarded as internal cognitive appraisals of environmental stimuli. The phenomenological critique of this cognitivist position has rejected the internalist idea. that our emotional and intentional states are hidden to others, and that feelings of empathy or sympathy should be conceived in analogy to a theory. Two alternative concepts of social understanding have been put forward, the one on a more phenomenological, the other on a more inactivist basis. According to the phenomenological concept of direct perception, we are well able to immediately perceive others' intentions and emotions, at least to a certain extent. On the one hand, in their expressive behavior. On the other hand, in their visible intentions in action, as being related to a meaningful context. So when I see another person approaching a door, I can easily see that he wants to enter the next room, open the door and enter the next room, so I can see his or her intention. And seeing another person cry, one sees part of her sadness. Seeing another person running after the train, one sees her intention to reach the train without any need of inference. And second, according to interaction theory, social cognition is mainly based on social interactions, which induce, on a pre-reflective level, mutual bodily resonance and corresponding mutual modification of each other's states. I will come back to this later on. So accordingly, phenomenological and inactive approaches to sociality do not start from isolated individuals and their inner states, but from a priority of intercorporeality, interaffectivity, and interbodily resonance. In particular, the latter concept implies the idea that the emergent dynamics of interaction creates shared affective experience, and this is the alternative to the idea of inferring others' internal states. Now, to elaborate this concept of embodied interaffectivity in the following, I will introduce first a general concept of embodied affectivity, which regards emotions not as inner mental states, but as encompassing even spatial phenomena that connect the embodied subject and the situation in a circular interaction. This leads to a concept of embodied interaffectivity as being based on intercorporeal resonance. And finally, developmental accounts of intersubjectivity point out that sharing and understanding each other's feelings is also based on an intercorporeal memory that is acquired in early childhood and conveys a basic sense of social attunement, a kind of social musicality. So going through these three chapters, so to speak, of my lecture, we can start with the question, what are emotions? So to begin with, we should abandon the idea that emotions are only mental phenomena, only in the head or in the mind. In fact, the experienced space around us is always charged with affective qualities. We feel, for example, the hilarity of a party, the sadness of a funeral march, or the uncanniness of a somber wood at night. So the world around us is already affectively loaded, so to speak. And emotions may be regarded as effective responses to events of concern to us, implying specific bodily reactions and motivating a specific expressive behavior. So emotions emerge from experiencing situations, persons, and objects, which themselves have their expressive and affective qualities. That means which, for example, attract us or repel us. Emotions show us relevances, values, and affective qualities in our environment. Things appear to us as important, worthwhile, attractive, repulsive, expressive, and so on. And in a sense, emotions are ways of perceiving, namely perceiving salient features of a situation and giving them significance and weight, which they would not have without the emotion. Referring to Gibson's concept of affordances, that means offerings in the environment that are available to us. For example, a tree being something to climb on, or water being something to drink. One could also speak of affective affordances. So things appear to us as interesting, expressive, attractive, uncanny, and so on. Now, how do we experience the affective qualities of a given situation? Well, emotions are experienced through what I call bodily resonance. And this includes all kinds of local or general bodily sensations, feelings of warmth or coldness, tickling or shivering, pain, tension, relaxation, constriction or expansion, sinking, tumbling, etc. And emotions or bodily resonance includes bodily postures, straight, slumped, depressed, for example, and it includes movement tendencies, for example, approach or avoidance movement tendencies, clinging one's fist in rage, trying to hide the body in shame, withdrawing in fear. So there is no emotion with all these kinds of bodily resonance. Of course, when I'm moved by an emotion, I may not always be aware of my body. But being afraid, for instance, is not possible without feeling at least slight bodily tension or trembling, a slight beating of the heart or shortness of breath, and so on. It is through these sensations that we are anxiously directed towards a frightening situation. And therefore, bodily feelings and action tendencies are the very medium of our affective relation to the world. The body is a resonance body, or as William James put it, a most sensitive sounding board in which every emotion reverberates. Now, let us look at more recent research on the bodily resonance of emotions. And this research has been done in embodiment studies on affective tendencies that are created by certain bodily postures and bodily sensations. For example, Riskin and colleagues found that individuals recalled more negative life events or memories when sitting in a slumped position, as shown on the left side, and they recorded more positive events when sitting in an upright position, right side. Well, this is already a kind of research that has been done by Charles Schulz in the Peanuts. You may know this nice cartoon where Charlie Brown says, "This is my depressed stance. When you're depressed, it makes a lot of difference how you stand. The worst thing you can do is straighten up and hold your head high, because then you'll start to feel better." So down on the right side, if you're going to get any joy out of being depressed, you have got to stand like this. Well, of course, this a humorous example of embodiment research, but it's certainly, it hits the point. Let us go on. Struck and colleagues demonstrated that activation of the smiling muscle, so asking participants to hold a pen between their teeth, like on the right side, caused them to judge cartoons to be funnier than in the other condition, when smiling was inhibited by holding the pen between their lips, as shown on the left side. Then another study showed that approach motions, for example, during arm flexion, where you put your arms towards your body, so approach motions leaded to Chinese ideographs being evaluated more positively than when the movement was away from the body. Williams and Borg showed that holding a hot cup of coffee elicits a warmer impression of a target person, whom the study persons didn't know, than when they got a cup of iced coffee in their hands. So the warmness, more generous, more caring, more sympathetic impression was supported by the warmth of the hot cup in the hand. And another nice and stunning example results from Botox research. People who receive Botox in their frowning muscles, here on the right side, have an impaired understanding of negative semantic content of sentences, because the frowning muscles are an expression of critical or skeptical attitudes. And this may also be, may even be used for treatment of depression. After several weeks of Botox injection and applications, depressed patients had a significant better mood, because inhibiting the frowning also reduced the self-criticism of the patients. So these are some examples of the interaction between the bodily resonance and the emotional states or emotional dispositions. And they may be summarized as follows. When people adopt emotion-specific postures, show facial expressions, or make an emotional gesture, they tend to experience the associated emotion, and their attitudes towards objects or persons are tacitly influenced. And on the other hand, when expressive movements of the body are inhibited, like in the Botox case, then experiencing the associated emotions and affective affordances of the environment is impaired. Now we can go further and this can lead us to a model of embodied emotions or embodied affectivity. Emotions are generally bodily responses directed towards the values and affective qualities of a given situation. They encompass the subject and the situation, and therefore they also may not be localized in the interior of persons, neither in their psyche, whatever that is, nor only in their brain. Rather, the affected subject is engaged with an environment that has itself affect-like qualities. For example, in shame, an embarrassing situation and the dismissive gazes of others are experienced as a painful bodily affection, which is precisely the way the person feels his or her sudden devaluation in others' eyes. So the emotion of shame is extended over the feeling person and her body as well as the situation as a whole. Emotions now further imply two components of bodily resonance. A centripetal or affective component, that means being affected, moved, or touched by an event or a situation through various forms of bodily resonance. For example, here, the blushing and burning of shame, and we see very clearly that this is a centripetal direction, the fingers of the others, and the whole situation somehow collapses upon me. This is an affective component. On the other hand, there's also a centrifugal and emotive component. That means a bodily reaction readiness, implying specific tendencies of movement. For example, hiding, avoiding the other's gaze in shame, as the person does here, covering his face, covering his eyes. Or we also say, I want to even sink into the floor from shame. So I try to somehow escape the shameful situation. Other tendencies are approach, for example, in desire or anger, avoidance in fear, or being with in enjoyment, rejection in disgust, or dominance in pride. So in emotions, we are moved to move towards or against or away in a certain sense, in a certain way. Now, if we take all this together, emotions may be regarded as circular interactions or feedback cycles between the embodied on the left side and the situation the subject finds itself in on the right side. So being affected by the affective qualities of a given situation, by the values or value features of the situation, means an affection, an impression. And it triggers a specific bodily resonance, which now in turn influences the emotional perception of the situation and implies a corresponding emotion, a corresponding action readiness or expression. And that is precisely what the term emotion signifies, some emotion, some motion that is directed outward. Embodied affectivity now consists in the whole interactive cycle, which is crucially mediated by the resonance of the feeling body. Again, we can apply this to the example of shame, which I have shown. The affective qualities are the embarrassing situation. The affection is the feeling of this situation on one's own body as the bodily resonance of blushing or warmth or heat. And the emotional expression is lowering the gaze and trying to hide the gaze, trying to hide the body, and so on. And this, of course, is again directed towards the situation. So bodily resonance acts as a medium of our affective engagement in a situation. And we have seen in embodiment research that the modification of resonance leads to a changed affective perception. Thus, a lack of resonance will impede the perception of corresponding affective qualities or values. For example, the injection of Botox, as we have seen. And conversely, increasing a certain bodily feeling favors or increases the corresponding affective perception. For example, holding a hot cup of coffee elicits a warmer impression of a person. And thus the different components of the affective, perceptive motion cycle, the cycle of embodied emotions, influence each other in a circular way. An interesting case is also the loss of bodily resonance or affectability in depression, where the rigid body and the kind of rigidness that is visible in the person's countenance and the person's face leads even to a kind of affective depersonalization. One cannot feel anything any longer because the body is kind of frozen. The rigidness leads to a lack of bodily resonance and as well to a loss of interaffectivity, as we will see. The affective and the embodied affectivity is also something that is visible for others, and if the resonance is somehow disturbed, this will lead to a loss of interaffective resonance. Solomon, in his autobiographical account of his own depression, describes his condition as a loss of feeling, a numbness, which had infected all my human relations. I didn't care about love, about my work, about family, about friends any longer. So here the frozen body leads to a lack of feeling and even to the point of an affective depersonalization, feeling no longer as oneself, so to speak. Now, as we have seen, emotions imply embodied action tendencies. And more specifically in the social sphere, they are characterized by various movements towards someone, away from someone, that means they are essentially relational. As emotions towards or away from others, they are felt towards others, and they are also perceived by the others. So they are not only felt from the inside, but they are also visible in expression and behavior. The facial, gestural, postural expression of a feeling feeds back into the embodied interaction and means a modification of interaffectivity. So our body is affected by the other's expression, and we experience the kinetics and intensity of his emotions through our own bodily kinesthesia and sensations. This creates a dynamic interplay which forms the basis of social understanding and empathy, and which I describe as mutual incorporation. One can also speak of extended bodies, as it were. And here, two cycles of embodied affectivity become intertwined. And thus they continuously modify each partner's affective resonance. I will show this in another scheme. Let us assume that person A on the left side is a person whose emotion, for example, anger, manifests itself in typical bodily changes, facial, gestural, interoceptive changes, as we feel when we are in anger. So our body functions as a felt resonance board for the anger. So person A feels the anger as the tension in his face, as the sharpness in his voice, the arousal in his body, etc. And these interoceptive feelings may be termed bodily resonance or also intra-bodily resonance. This resonance is an expression. Now we enter the circle, so to speak. This resonance is an expression of the emotion at the same time. That means the anger becomes visible and is perceived by A's partner B on the right side. The expression will thus produce an impression, namely by triggering corresponding bodily feelings in B. So, for example, A's sinister gaze, the sharpness of his voice, or the expansive bodily movements, the aggressive movements, might induce in person B an unpleasant tension or even a jerk, a tendency to withdraw, even however slight. So B not only sees the anger immediately in A's face and gesture, but also feels it through his own intra-bodily resonance. However, it doesn't stay like this, because the impression caused in B now in turn becomes an expression for A, and that's the lower part of the circle. So the expression of B will immediately affect the bodily reaction of A, change his expression, however slightly, and so forth. And this creates a circular interplay of expressions, impressions, and reactions which run in split seconds and constantly modify each partner's bodily state. They have become parts of a dynamic sensory motor and interaffective system that connects both bodies by what we can call interbodily resonance. Of course, the signals and reactions involved proceed far too quickly to stand out discreetly and become conscious as such. Instead, both partners will experience a specific feeling of being somehow bodily connected with the other. And this is also a holistic feeling of the encompassing atmosphere of the shared situation. As the example of anger already shows, this interbodily resonance and the resulting atmosphere is by no means restricted to harmonious social situations. Interpersonal conflicts may create most intense forms of mutual resonance and atmospheric tensions. So, in other words, resonance takes place on a range between consonance and dissonance. Empathic understanding is thus not only based on mimetic bodily tendencies, such as subliminally imitating another's smile or his painful, distorted facial expression when he is in pain. We can also have non-mimetic bodily resonance. And in order to recognize and feel the anger in another space, we do not have to experience or simulate anger ourselves. Our primary reaction might rather be oppositional than concordant. We might feel tense, frightened, or tend to withdraw. So interbodily resonance may include both mimetic as well as complementary or antagonistic dynamics. Moreover, even in consonant or harmonious interactions, there's never a complete attunement, synchrony, or in-phase mutual behavior. The other's body always offers at least some resistance to perfect attunement, usually resulting in sequences of matching and mismatching episodes. This has also been shown in infant research. There are micro interaction patterns which consist of repeated sequences of matches, mismatches, and repairs between the baby and the mother. And similarly, in adult interactions, the observable coordination of movements and reactions never reaches a state of perfect synchronization. Even in a well-trained dancing couple, the other's body offers a slight resistance and unpredictability, which ensures that the dance is still an interaction, a joint achievement. This lack of complete congruence is even crucial for the distinction of self and other, which is maintained despite the mutual incorporation of interaffectivity. The resonant dynamics is jointly created and cannot be broken down to individual behavior. The behaviors and experiences of two interaction partners match each other not completely. Each of them behaves and experiences differently how they would do outside of the process, which thus gains a certain emergent autonomy. As we can see, intercorporeality means the social understanding, means that social understanding is not an inner modeling or simulation in a detached observer. Inside and outside are not separate domains, but only directions of motion within an ongoing mutual transition between expression and impression, or emotion and affection. To illustrate this, let us imagine a football play in which one player sees his teammate raise his arms, rejoicing in joy over a goal. According to the cognitivist or representationalist account, there are objects out there for us. In this case, a body whose features are transmitted to the retina, then further processed by the brain in order to create an internal representation of the other's body, which is then combined with a theory of mind, TOM, or a simulation mechanism, resulting in the appraisal, oh, he is happy. This is a linear concept of cognitivism. But instead of this linear concept, an embodied or inactive approach emphasizes the circular sensorimotor dynamics within the dyad of embodied agents. So here, both partners are linked to form an encompassing system through mutual perceptions and reactions. Grasping, pointing, handing over, moving towards, smiling, crying, all these are not just individual and external behaviors that we have to furnish with a meaning, but through our bodily resonance, they become inherently expressive and meaningful for us. And thus, the footballer on the right side will immediately perceive the other as an expressive body, even a body that is obviously happy, and even a body that is ready to hug, that could be hugged. And empathically sharing his pleasure, this might easily result in spontaneously embracing his teammate. Certainly no introspection or simulation or theory of mind is necessary to share the pleasure. The embrace is merely the manifestation of both players' intercorporeality or interaffectivity. Now, this concept of embodied affectivity and interaffectivity describes universal structures of experience. On the other hand, there is no doubt that the forms of emotional expression and interaction are to a large extent shaped by one's individual biography, as well as by one's cultural background. So emotions primarily emerge from, and they are embedded in dyadic interactions from early childhood on, in dyadic interactions of infant and caregiver. From then on, patterns of interaction are sedimented gradually in the infant's body memory, resulting in an intercorporeal memory. The notion of body memory, which I use here, should denote all forms of implicit memory that are mediated by the body and that are realized without explicit intention or recollection, just in everyday conduct. So implicit or body memory comprises all those customs, habits, manners, practices, which are performed unreflectively as a matter of course. It is also a procedural memory for motion patterns such as walking, dancing, for handling instruments, for dealing with familiar situations. Explicit recollection or memory is directed back to the past. Implicit or body memory reenacts the past experience through the body's present performance. It may be regarded as our lived past, so to speak. We do not have to go back to former times in order to perform with our implicit memory. And now, more specifically, intercorporeal memory means a practical knowledge of how to interact with others in face-to-face encounters. And this knowledge is already acquired early in childhood. Let us look at these early learning processes in more detail. Infant research has shown that babies are already able to imitate the facial expressions of others, such as mouth opening, tongue protrusion, or frowning, or mouth or the pressing together of the lips, as on the right side. Obviously, the newborn's body schema is characterized by an intermodal openness. And that enables the child to immediately transpose the perceived expressions of others into its own bodily feelings and movement. So the body of the other is experienced as familiar, somehow like my own body from the start. And since this bodily imitation also evokes corresponding feelings, bodily resonance also emerges in the early dyadic interactions. And this is supported by the fact that 6 to 8 weeks olds already engage in proto-conversation with their mothers by smiling, vocalizing, gesturing, even in turn-taking patterns, which results in a fine-tuned coordination of movements and synchrony of expressions that has often been compared to a couple dance. As early as in the first months, infants become also capable of discerning emotions in others, such as happiness, sadness, and surprise, through the postures, movements, facial expressions, and vocalizations of others. The basis for this is that different sense modalities can have the same kinematics and dynamics, and thus express the same affect. Infants both perceive and express affects as the intermodal quality of rhythmic, melodic, vocal, facial, and gestural characteristics, flow patterns, kinematics, such as crescendo, decrescendo, accelerando, ritardando, rising or falling movements, flowing or explosive dynamics, everything that may be expressed by Italian terms of musical dynamics. Stern has called these dynamics vitality affects. For example, the feeling of joy may have various intermodal dynamics and can be expressed by raising one's arms, by raising one's voice, by raising one's eyes and smiling. And this is the basis for the direct perception of others' emotional states, even in earliest childhood. According to Daniel Stern, the temporal flow patterns and kinematics are felt by both partners as an effective attunement. They result in shared dyadic affective states, often an intense pleasure or joy. So the emerging affect during a joyful play situation may not be divided or distributed among a mother and infant. It arises from the in-between, so to speak, from the shared situation in which both are in which both are immersed. The recursive patterns of all these interactions are gradually sedimented in the infant's body memory, leading to what Ruth and Stern have called implicit relational knowing. And this means a pre-reflective bodily know-how of interacting with others, how to share pleasure, how to elicit attention, how to express happiness, avoid rejection, re-establish contact, etc. And through this, the infant acquires specific interactive schemes of being with, as Daniel Stern has called them. We could also say body micro practices that are needed for an increasing range of interactions. Implicit relational knowledge is a kind of temporally organized, a musical memory for the rhythm and dynamics that are subliminally present in the interaction with others. And it also implies an interaffective memory for the specific feel of shared situations and the emotions that they carry. We might even think of the example of the football players once more and realize that the hug, the embrace that we have seen is in a way a reenactment of early experiences with one's mother or with one's father, with one's parents, as shown on the left side. So see that the kind of feeling and the kind of posture and the way the arms are held is quite similar in both cases. And of course, this feel of how it is to be embraced, to be hugged, is something that is acquired very early on and is transmitted as an implicit relational knowing to later situations that feel more or less like the first ones we have experienced in life. So, as we can see also here, body memory is not restricted to single bodies. Each sequence of interaction acquires its own history when it is repeated, and it thus prefigures future interactions between the partners. One may, for example, develop a specific style of interacting with a close friend, a particular way of talking, a special style of humor, and so on, which are only possible with this person, and they re-emerge with this person immediately, even after years, when we see this person again. And then the intercorporeal memories of both partners unite to form a joint procedural field that suggests typical postures, typical interaction patterns, typical shared experiences. And thus we may say that there is, in a certain sense, a memory of the interaction itself, a dyadic body memory. Let us take another example, namely a well-trained couple of dancers who move easily with the rhythm of the music, make the suitable turns even on the slightest signals of the other, and whose hands and bodies find each other without guidance of the gaze. Both partners apply their procedural and interbodily skills, and yet they move and feel in a way that is only possible within this interaction. So together they create the spatio-temporal pattern of the dance, which in turn draws them into its superordinate dynamics, implying the mutual incorporation which I have described. And here, rhythm and melody of the music, of course, support this mutual incorporation by providing dynamic rhythms for the movements of both partners. Their interaction has gained a kind of autonomy because each of them behaves and experiences differently from how they would do outside the process. One could, of course, ask where we should localize this memory of joint dancing and other skillful bodily interaction. Well, we could say there is a memory of the system, which must finally be based on the individual memories of the agents involved in order to become effective for their behavior. On the other hand, it is only together that the individuals can reenact this dyadic pattern, and this justifies to attribute this memory in a certain sense to the dyad itself. It is a memory of we can, so to speak. And so we can see that intercorporeality means more than interbodily resonance and mutual incorporation. It may also be regarded as an overarching system which over time gains its own patterns as an autonomous dynamics with its peculiar history. To conclude, I've outlined a concept of primary or pre-reflective intersubjectivity, which is based on embodied affectivity and interaffectivity. And it conceives emotions not as inner mental states to be deciphered and inferred from the outside, but as states that individuals share through bodily resonance and states that connect them with one another in circular interactions. In face-to-face encounters, each partner's lived body reaches towards the other to form an overarching system through interbodily resonance and mutual incorporation. And so social understanding is primarily based on intercorporeality. It emerges from the interactive practice and coordination of embodied agents. So we do not need to form internal models or representations of others in order to understand and communicate with them. As bodily subjects, we are always already involved in a shared affective and expressive space. Developmental research indicates that empathy is based on an intercorporeal memory or an implicit relational knowledge of how to interact with others. This memory is acquired in early childhood and conveys a basic sense of social attunement. In each social encounter, both partners unconsciously reenact a history of embodied socialization that has shaped their styles of interacting. And finally, embodied intersubjectivity can also give rise to self-sustaining interaction patterns that go beyond the behavioral dispositions of only the individuals. These interaction patterns may be attributed to a memory of the intercorporeal system that is actualized and modified in every new encounter of the participating agents or persons. To be sure, this embodied concept of interaffectivity does not exhaust the possibilities of empathic understanding. Because on the basis of primary bodily empathy, we are also able to explicitly represent or imagine or even question the other's situation. This happens in particular when their behavior seems ambiguous, when we don't quite understand it, or when an irritation occurs. And then through additional information about the other person, his situation, and even with additional inference, we can then try to enhance our understanding, infer hidden possible intentions, and in this way also even deepen our empathy. We could think about what has made the other person that angry, what was his specific vulnerability to react with this anger and rage in this particular situation. We can take the other's perspective, we can transpose ourselves in the other situation and imagine how we would feel or react in his place. These are additional cognitive means of enhancing and extending our primary empathy. One might nevertheless argue that the concept of theory of mind is misleading or was misleading from the start, because the very term presupposes a kind of scientific approach to others' supposedly hidden minds, a theory of how others work as the standard mode of intersubjectivity. But the need for such approaches, inferential cognitive approaches, arises mainly in situations in which intercorporeal communication becomes ambiguous or restricted, or when it is missing completely, such as, for example, in poker games, or when it is missing in a written exchange. So sophisticated or even detective-like cognitive mechanisms or capacities are not necessary, and they are not sufficient to enable empathic intersubjective relations. Despite those options, these additional options for extending understanding, our everyday social encounters remain based on embodied primary intersubjectivity. So far, my consideration. Thank you very much for your attention.